And we want to get deeper now into the issue of military spending in not only Latin America, but the rest of the world as well. I'm joined here in Washington by Benjamin Friedman, Research Fellow in Defense and Homeland Security Studies at the CATO Institute. Benjamin, we want to start with a graphic here. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute tracked 23 countries that have at least doubled or in some cases increased fivefold their military spending in the past decade. This list includes China, Russia, and several in the region, not to mention a handful in Africa. And then going back here into the Americas, there's Honduras, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Argentina. You know, is this pace of military spending something that we're likely to see continue, or are these military budgets maxed out in some of these countries?
No, I don't think most of these countries are maxed out. I think they can spend more because the main reason, at least the majority of these countries are spending more, is probably just economic growth and more resources to their military. They have, and their militaries are also in some sense becoming more professional, and more professional militaries can become more expensive. Sometimes when you become a more developed country, you have more expensive labor, and a lot of these costs are just personnel costs, so they're spending more on the people. So I think at least in Latin America and some of the developing countries, they can spend more. Russia and some of the more developed countries, it's, I think, going to be more of a challenge for them to keep increasing the spending as they hope to.
But then, you know, we just saw this piece in Brazil, so it makes sense. One more graphic I'd like you to get your take on. This change in military spending from 2012 to 2013, just 1 year. Global military budgets actually shrank a little bit during that time, especially across North America. Aside from Eastern Europe, the regions leading the way in increased military budgets are in Asia and Latin America. You mentioned a little bit of that, but are you surprised by that at all?
No, I think the Asian story is really about China and countries reacting to China, but then again, also about economic growth. The same story that I gave before is that countries get a little bit richer and they have more money to spend. In some cases, less so in Asia, but maybe in the case of China or some of the Latin American countries, you're seeing spending that's driven by internal security needs. So not the traditional state-on-state threats, but more by internal unrest. So I think it's driven in part by the economic recovery around the world, and so it's not deeply surprising.
Staying in Asia, I want to ask you about Japan. Japan is looking to significantly increase its defense spending, something that's been publicized. And China also announced that in recent political meetings that it would increase military spending at some 12%, also something very talked about. Combine this, though, to the military budget of the United States. And some would consider the fact that China and the U.S. account for half of all the world's spending. To what degree does this military power translate into economic power?
Not much. I think it's more that, you try to use economic power to build military strength and hopefully accomplish some diplomatic objectives. And of course, states sort of hope that ultimately military wealth will lead to security and therefore wealth. So that's their goal. But in the short term, it's hard to see how the differences in fluctuation in how much we spend on the military or China spends on its military really matter to wealth. And of course, it costs something. That's a bunch of money that you're taking out of the private economy or in some other use and spending on the military. So there's also an economic cost to more military spending.
We have time for one quick question. There are arguments to be made here in the United States and in other countries against shrinking military budgets. And some see military spending as a form of a jobs program, in a way. If military budgets are trimmed, what kind of impact would that have on the overall economy?
Well, it's like any other form of government spending. You have a bunch of people who are employed by some government program. Defense spending in the United States tends to be fairly technology intensive. We're building fancy things, complex things, so that's expensive. It doesn't employ that many people compared to other sectors. So the effect of cutting the spending is going to depend on what you do instead. So if you're moving into something that's more labor intensive, you're going to employ more people. But there's always a cost in terms of the people employed in the places where there's bases or production lines. There's always going to be some people who lose out. But I think overall, it would be good for the U.S. economy to cut spending a bit.
All right, Benjamin Friedman from the CATO Institute, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us
Thanks.
on the show.